this YouTube video is all about props, and at our studio we use them all the time, and so I can see firsthand that there is often an aversion to props. People don't want to use them for some reason. I think it's because it feels like you're cheating or you're not working as hard as you could if you weren't using props, when in actuality our props help bring us into alignment, and when we're in alignment we're asking all of the little muscles to do their work rather than just relying on the bigger muscles or the more bendy parts of the body to take over, right? So when we're using props, we can't fall into the path of least resistance or the easy exit route. And so sometimes people don't want to use props just because they're too hard to organize. So what we always recommend is having your blocks at the front edge of your mat, as well as your strap. And more than that, the strap, it's nice to have one of these buckles in it and then to have the buckle already looped, right? Because if your teacher asks you to take the loop around your foot or around your arms and then you're sitting there struggling with getting the loop together, it does make using the props a little less attractive. And then if you use a blanket, we find that that's nice to have at the back edge of the mat because you tend to not really need it at the front edge of the mat. So having the props neat and tidy and easy to use can be one way to be more interested in using props. Okay, so my favorite prop is the block, so we're going to start there. And not all blocks are created equal, right? We have our cork blocks, which are very heavy and they're solid, they're not smushy at all. And then there's this other kind of foam block that's somewhat smushy, somewhat solid. And then this block is very smushy. So, sometimes we want a block that's lighter and smushy, and sometimes we want a block that is harder and heavier. However, I always use the cork blocks no matter what, and I know other people that will always use the foam blocks no matter what. So just saying that maybe you're using the wrong block, and that's why you don't want to use it. And then we have our blanket, which is often used in Shavasana to help deepen the Shavasana, but mostly it's used in our forward folds to make sure we're not rocking behind our sit bones, which is going to cause some rounding in the low back, which also causes some injury in the low back or could lead to it. And then the strap, again, is another prop. So if you were to invest in props, I would get a blanket, a strap, and 2 blocks. And maybe play around at your local studio or wherever you practice yoga to see which blocks you like best before purchasing them. Okay, so we'll talk about our blocks first. And what the blocks typically do is help to lift the floor up to us so that we don't have to reach down to the ground, and when we reach down to the ground, we fall out of alignment. They also give feedback to the hands, the feet, the arms, and the legs. And so we'll show a few different examples of that. So Kajsa's with me today, and she's going to start by coming into a lunge. Okay, so if she keeps her hands on the floor, you can see that there's some rounding in the upper back just to get her hands to the floor. And there's also, you might not be able to see as clearly, the front hip tends to swing out. So when we use our blocks, we're trying to be able to lengthen the spine and also to make sure the front hip isn't swinging out. So when she comes onto the blocks, you can see that everything is a little bit more lifted. And sometimes because her hands are further away from the ground, it might feel like she's not doing as much. But as soon as she lifts her hands up, she's asking the other parts of the body to work so that she's not just dumping into the hands. All right, so you can see that from the heel to the crown of the head, she's in one long straight line, so she's not rounding her back. And then the front hip is no longer swinging out. So that would be one way that we use the blocks to lift the floor up to us. I can show another example of that in side angle. So if you plant your back foot down, and then if she doesn't use the block, when she lowers her hand down, you can see that her left shoulder is sort of rolling down. And again, you can't see the back hip quite so much, but I can see that it's swinging out. So we don't care how close the hand gets to the floor. That's not the point of side angle or triangle. As soon as she lifts her hand up a little bit, that bottom hand, now she's able to fully stack her shoulders, and the right glute is able to firm under some more. So when we're here, we're not allowing the body to fall into the path of least resistance. Instead, we're pulling everything into the midline so you can create spaciousness from our center. You can come out of that. Okay, so those are 2 examples of using the blocks to lift the ground up to us so that we're not collapsing down with gravity. Another way that we use blocks is feedback for the hands and the feet, or the arms and the legs. So often we ask people to take the block between their hands as they lift their arms up for Urdhva Hastasana. So when we do that, we have that feedback not only of for most people about shoulders distance, but also when you press the amount of the index finger into the block, it really helps to energize the entire arm. So the muscles in the inner shoulder especially are working. So reach the arms forward without the block, and then we want to roll the shoulders back in socket and lift the arms up. Right? So if we never use the block and we're not sure where we're supposed to be, the arms tend to bend, the front ribs tend to puff. Okay, so then you can take your arms down, and then with the feedback of the block, you can take, yes, so this is a nice reason to use the soft one. If you have tighter shoulders, the softer block is going to still give you that feedback of where your hands and arms are, and you can still root into the mound of the index finger, but you don't have to deal with the weight of a cork block. Okay, so she reaches the arms forward, roll the shoulders back, and then inhale, lift the arms up. And it seems like a minor detail, but it's helping to let us know where we are in space. And often for the more advanced classes, we add this in our Warrior One or our chair pose. And then in beginner classes, it's just nice to isolate this movement on its own so people can start to understand where their hands and arms are in space. And you can lower down. She hates that. Another way that you can use your block is for feedback for the legs and the feet. So you can come onto your belly, and we're going to take a block between the ankles. So now Kajsa has the block in between her ankles. And so often a common misalignment in our Cobra or Sphinx is that the outer ankle rolls out. Will you show what that looks like? So when that happens, the leg isn't working quite as hard. And more than that, the outer ankle has the most sprained ligaments in the body, so we can use this opportunity to strengthen the outer ankles. So she has the block there to grip the block with the ankles, which helps to fire up the entire leg. Right? And then she could lift into Cobra if she wants, but that's the way the block would work there for feedback for our feet. And then you can come down onto or flip over onto your back. So another way that you can use the block for feedback for your legs is to squeeze the block between the legs in your bridge pose. Okay, so the block, you want to place the block so that when you squeeze it, your thigh bones are parallel to each other. So depending on the shape of our legs, some of us will have it between the knees, and some of us will have it pretty close to the top of the thigh. So you just want to check that when you're squeezing the block, it's not causing the knees to splay out. And you don't have to lift into it, but this is what it would look like. If you do want to lift in, you'd press into your heels, lift your hips, and then you're squeezing the block with the inner thighs to make sure your knees don't splay. Because when the knees splay, the low back gets really narrow. You can lower down when you're ready. Okay, so in these last few things, it's actually making the pose that much harder because instead of, once again, letting our body just collapse where it wants to or find the path of least resistance, we're still hugging things into the midline and making those smaller muscles work. So another way that you can use the blocks is to help alleviate sort of tightness in the shoulders or in the hamstrings. So in the case of down dog, you can slide the blocks underneath your hands, which does help with both tightness in the shoulders and the hamstrings. And it just helps to give you a little bit more ease in the pose. So it's the same thing, she's just lifting the floor up a little bit to create a longer arm, which helps the shoulders and also helps the hamstrings. So another example of using the blocks in this way would be in our upward bow, where a lot of us will set the blocks against the wall and just give yourself a little extra lift to bypass tightness in the shoulders. So another way to use the block is to stop hyperextension, especially with the knees. I know I struggle with that, so a lot of times if you're in straight leg poses for a while and you're feeling it in your knee, so I can see that happening in class when we come out of a straight leg pose and people are like bending and straightening their legs like they were locking their knee. So one way to avoid that is to use the block behind your calf. So Kajsa's going to come into Parsvottanasana, or just at least the legs of it. And then you want to set the block at an angle, so it's going to be wedged, right? So the block is not flat on the floor, it's on an angle, and you wedge it between your calf. And then as soon as she does that, she's no longer able to lock the knee, which means that instead of sitting in her joints, the muscles are actually going to be able to work. So this is useful in Parsvottanasana and Parivrtta Trikonasana. And just as a general note, if you're feeling this in a straight leg pose, you're probably locking your knees in Prasarita too, so you might want to start pressing the calf toward the shin some more. And then another way to use your block, lift the floor up to support the head. So you could do that in child's pose, taking the forehead to the block. And it is supposed to help with stress and migraines too, so even if you can get your head to the floor, you could use the block. And then another way to use it would be in down dog. So what you want to be careful of when you come into it, and you do have to sort of play around with the height of the block, so you just want your third eye on it. And you want to make sure you're not collapsing down into the block, but you're moving the block toward your head, wherever your head naturally lands. And then another way is in prasarita. So you could come into wide-legged stance. And then this one, the crown of the head, could come to the block or, again, the third eye. And so just giving yourself some support. So show them what it looks like without the block if your head were just to hang in that uncomfortable way. Yeah. So the next prop we'll talk about is the strap. And the strap, instead of lifting the floor up to us, it helps to sort of lengthen our arms, which does really have the same sort of end benefit as the blocks lifting the floor up. So it helps to lengthen the arms, and it, again, just like the block, gives us feedback as to where our body is in space. So like I said before, you want to make sure that you have this loop in your strap before you start your class so that it's ready to go and you don't have to deal with it later. Okay, so the first one we'll do is dolphin or dolphin plank, and you'll open the loop of your strap the same distance you are from shoulder to shoulder. Yeah, so outer shoulder to outer shoulder, and then you'll take it above your elbows. And then for dolphin or dolphin plank, you can either have the palms flat with the block in between or interlacing your hands. Okay? And then when you're ready, you can lift up. And what tends to happen, there's so much going on in both of these poses that we tend to lose our foundation and the elbows tend to splay. So as soon as the strap is there, it's once again pulling things into the midline to create more space and ultimately to stop us from falling out of alignment, which is going to end up hurting the shoulders or could end up hurting the shoulders over time. You can lower your knees when you're ready. Okay, so similar to keeping the elbows in, you can use the strap around your legs the same way that we did the block between our legs in our bridge pose. So in that case, you would want to open the loop of the strap or close the loop of the strap so it's the same distance you are from hip to hip. Yep. And then you'd place it around like the mid-thigh. And so this one is a little less work than squeezing the block because you don't have to use any muscular effort to pull the legs in. It's just the strap that's stopping the knees from splaying out. But it has the same end benefit. So when you're ready, you lift up. And this one too, sometimes teachers will say try to evade the strap, so you're trying to pull your inner thighs a little closer together just to give more work here if you wanted to. But the strap is nice for beginners or someone who's working with an injury so they don't have to deal with gripping the block quite so much. And you can lower down when you're ready. Okay, so those were two examples of the strap trying to pull the elbows in, pull the knees in so that we're not going to let the elbows or the knees splay. And those are important because when the knees or elbows splay in either of those poses we just demonstrated, it causes too much strain in either the low back if the knees splay or the rotator cuff if the elbows splay. So the other way we use the strap is to lengthen the arms. So this one, you would probably want to tighten the loop of the strap. And we'll take it around the ball of the foot. So you can do this on your back. We'll take the strap around the ball of the foot. And you do want to make sure you get it right around the ball of the foot, because if it goes around your arch, it's not really a crime, but you won't be able to push the ball of the foot into it. And we really want the big toe mound to press in so we can get our leg working. All right, so you can straighten into both legs. And so what this allows Kajsa to do is keep her shoulders heavy, the chest open, while still getting the benefit of lengthening the hamstring, among many other things. So if she were really excited about grabbing her foot, can you show what that would look like? Yeah, so then the leg bends, and if she decided to straighten her lifted leg, the other leg would bend. So the body is going to constantly find an exit route. Right, so as you can see, as soon as she straightened her lifted leg, the left thigh bone popped up. So just using the strap is going to allow us to avoid all of that. Both legs can stay straight, and the hip can stay pinning in. And this is the same thing that happens when we're standing. A lot of people are really excited about grabbing the big toe. When we grab the big toe like that and we can't get our legs straight, then we're missing the opportunity to really fully stretch the hamstrings as well as strengthen the other parts of the body. So you can release out of that. And then make your way back up. All right, so another way to use the strap is to help create openness through the shoulders. Right? So if you're coming into the C position or the hands interlaced behind your back and you can't lift your hands away from the back body, or if when you do the shoulders roll forward, then simply separating your hands a bit is going to help to open the chest. So there's a couple ways to do that. You can loop your hands through the strap. And I've learned from my tight-shouldered friends that if that, even the way that Kajsa has it, is too much, yeah, you can have the loop in between the index finger and the thumb. And then you can see how she can lift the arms far away from her back body while also rolling the shoulders open. Some people like to hold the strap, so you just want to be careful if you hold the strap that you're not turning the hands forward, because then you still might end up rolling the shoulders forward, and then the whole use of the strap becomes pointless. Okay, so the last prop we'll talk about is the blanket. And the blanket, like I said, it's really nice to use it in Shavasana just to drape it over your hips or to roll it under the backs of the knees or under the length of the spine. And the heaviness of the blanket is different. Not all of these blankets are created the same, just like the blocks. So I like the heavier the blanket, the more deeply you can fall into Shavasana. It's just sturdier. Okay, so when we use it for our forward folds, typically we want to fold it this way. And the point is to sort of tip the pelvis forward so that we're not rocked behind the sit bones and flattening the curve of the low back. Right, so if you're able to sit upright and keep the natural curve of your low back, then you don't need the blanket. But if you're back here, no matter what you do, you can't lift up on top of your sit bones, that's when the blanket is helpful. So you can set that underneath your sit bones. So we want to be mindful that when we sit on the blanket, we don't sit the entire bottom on the blanket, because then it's not going to do anything. So you're just sitting right on the edge of the blanket, and it helps to tip the pelvis forward so that we're keeping the natural curve of the low back. And then, of course, the blankets are also imperative, in my opinion, for shoulder stand, which is a separate video. And we did just want to mention a couple other things and common poses. So in figure 4, it can be really helpful to use the props in one of two ways. You can come back down onto your back and have both the block and the strap nearby. Okay, so come into figure 4 without using the prop. And then hold on to the back of the leg. Okay, so you can see it's possible for Kajsa to hold on to the back of the leg, and she's in the basic shape of the pose. She's fine. If as a teacher, I wouldn't say anything about this. You can also see that her shoulders are kind of rolling away from the ground. So you might not realize that your shoulders are rolling away from the ground. So two ways to use props here are first the strap, which you take behind the back of the leg. Okay, so once she does that, her shoulders can just relax down a little bit more. We don't want to be causing strain in the shoulders while we're opening the outer hip. So that's one way to use the prop. And then another way to use a prop in this is to just step your foot up onto a block, which can be, for some people, a little bit trickier to get the foot under there. And then again, her chest, her upper body can just completely release. So that's a personal preference as to whether you would want to use the strap or the block. But I would encourage you to try it, because sometimes we don't realize that we're straining until we use the prop. Okay. And then another pose like figure 4, where you can use props to make it more comfortable, is child's pose. Right? That's a pose that we do often, and some people just hate it because it's really uncomfortable on the hip crease or the knees or the tops of the feet. So that's where both the blanket and the block can be useful. So if you take the blanket and that same fold that we used for the forward folds, one way to use it is to take it behind the backs of the knees, and that helps with any knee compression. Another way to use the blanket is to put it in your hip crease. So a lot of people who are more bendy just end up sitting right in their hips. Yes, you can slide it right in your hip crease. A little less than that. Yeah. And then you fold over, you just are a little less compact there. And then another way to use the blanket, if it's bothering your feet, I would open it one from there so it's a little bit flatter, and then you just put your feet on top of it. And so it just creates some softness so that the bony feet issue isn't an issue. And then lastly, you could use the blanket or a block underneath your forehead. Okay, so if your head doesn't make it to the ground, you could stack blocks, but sometimes using the blanket is nicer because it's just a little bit softer. Okay, so those are some ways to make child's pose balasana more comfortable, although it doesn't work for everybody, so you could always just rest however it is comfortable for you. So I hope you've found this helpful. I know that at our studio, we try to encourage everybody to use the props because it does help so much finding those little details of each pose that really make the poses come alive and are that much more challenging. So thank you for watching.